Welcome back in our study of Romans chapter 10. I want to now go to verses number 14. I think we're going to look at verse 14 through 17. In verse 14 through 17, where it says, "How then shall they call on him in whom they have not heard? And how shall they believe in him on whom they have not heard? And how shall they hear without a preacher? And how shall they preach except they be sent? As it is written, how beautiful are the feet of them that preach the gospel of peace and bring glad tidings of good things." When we read traditionally, when we read Romans chapter 10 and verse number 14, it automatically, or by habit, it has come to our minds that it's talking about the preaching of the New Testament gospel. Because when we think that verse number 11 through 13 is talking about people calling upon the name of the Lord in the salvation prayer, when it says, "Whosoever calleth upon the name of the Lord shall be saved," as we explained in the previous lesson, that whosoever calls upon the name of the Lord here has to do with among the Jews and the Gentiles. The whosoever is whether or not they are a Jew or a Gentile. They are right with God if they are a worshiper. Worshiper means to be a caller upon the name of the Lord, or actually to be already an engaged worshiper, someone who's already saved. The question was whether or not the Gentiles should have a right to even be saved. That was what verse number 11 through 13 was settling. Paul was saying, whosoever it is, whether it's a Jew or Gentile, if they're saved, they're saved. And so when that verse is misunderstood to think, to make people think that he's talking about conversion and going out and winning souls and people, whosoever calls on the name of the Lord, an altar call and a crusade, then they're converted by that process, then that is where the seed of deceit comes in, where it is trying to say that people are saved by making a salvation prayer. And this has nothing to do with salvation prayers. This is, again, settling the Jewish issue. In the first century church, there were certain Jews that were locked in, they're stuck into Judaism, stuck into the Old Testament, and they could not conceptually see how salvation could be so easy, free to us through Jesus Christ, and that it is free to everyone, to the Jew and to the Gentile. This is the main issue. This is not about conversion. And the multitude of the world is confused. Even as I'm explaining this now, it's hard for you to get that out of your mind. That you keep trying to reconcile this with conversion. It has nothing to do with conversion. When I had a rough time with this, when I first got the revelation, I kept trying to reconcile Romans chapter 10 with Acts 10, Acts 2:38, and Matthew 28:9. They don't work together. They're not the same thing. Romans 10 is not about conversion at all. And the only way you're going to understand it is to get that out of your mind and start reading the passage for what it's saying. That's the only way you're going to understand Romans 10. Is by understanding, first of all, that it's not a conversion passage. It's a passage that's dealing with the Jew and the Gentile issue in the first century church. And there is not one verse in the Romans chapter 10 where Paul is referring to the conversion of sinners to Christ. Not one. All of these verses that Paul is using is teaching the Jews and the Gentiles in the first century church how to handle the Jewish issue and how to worship Christ alone. Confess with your mouth the Lord Jesus means to preach Jesus instead of preaching the law. And the entire chapter, even if you go to verse 1, Paul is talking about the Jews. He's talking about the Jews and their situation. And he's trying to explain to this first century church that had been is so influenced by what the Jews said. He starts off the very first verse in Romans 10, said, "Brethren, my heart's desire and prayer for Israel is that they might be saved." He's talking about the Jews corporately, that they will be saved, because they're not saved. And why are they not saved? Not necessarily because they're drinking booze or getting drunk or visiting prostitutes, lying and stealing. That's not what he's talking about here. They are unsaved because they don't have the right creed. They don't worship the Lord Jesus in their ceremonies. They exclude the Lord Jesus. This entire chapter is about the corporate acceptance and inclusion of the Lord Jesus in the worship of the church. It's an in-church matter about the concept of how we worship. New Testament worship is through the Lord Jesus. It's through the preaching and the worshiping of the Lord Jesus. The word preach in the chapter, in the verses 7 through 9, is the word confess means to preach there. It's not talking about a personal confession of anyone. So, but what Paul is doing is explaining to the church about the Jews and how they got in the state that they're in. They're not saved as a corporate people because they have rejected Christ. Verse 2 says, "For I bear them record that they have a zeal of God, but not according to knowledge." They have a zeal concerning the things of God. Their zeal is locked under the Old Testament law and rituals and things like that. But that's not according to knowledge. He says, for they being ignorant of the righteousness of God's righteousness, and going about to establish their own righteousness, have not submitted themselves unto the righteousness of God. And how do they do it? Because they rejected Christ. And this is what this is about. It's getting them lined up with the right worship and right righteousness. And that's why he in Romans 10, where he says, if they really want to be right, if they really want to be saved, according to this definition of saved in the first verse, it's not saved because they're not worshiping. They don't have the right worship. Therefore they're unsaved as a corporate people because they have rejected the one who they should be worshiping, and that is the Lord Jesus. And that's why Romans 10:9 says, if you shall confess with your mouth preach Lord Jesus and believe him in your heart instead of the rituals, then you shall be saved as a people. And so he's trying to teach the right creed. All right, so that's what Romans chapter 10 is about. It's about the righteousness-seeking people, the church, and the Jews who are in the church understanding that the law is over. And that now their focus should be on Lord Jesus in the church. Him and his life, his death, his burial, and his resurrection. And it's not by rituals, but it's by believing in your heart that God has raised him from the dead, and then they will be right then if they do that. So the entire chapter of Romans 10 is a chapter that is given an appraisal of the corporate status of the Jews in relationship to the church, to explain to the church why the Jews cannot be listened to. The reason why the Jews are so far off track. He's trying to explain to them that it's because Israel has rejected the Lord Jesus. Not only were they rejecting him in the first century church, but now in verse number 14, Paul takes us down and explains to us how they have rejected him rejected God in their history. The Jews rejected God by stoning the prophets. Rejected God in their history. And that's the reason why he describes them in the very last verse of this chapter as being a foolish and a gainsaying people. They are foolish and gainsaying. This is a corporate chapter here. And it's dealing with Israel, and it's dealing with what the right worship should have been, and what the right worship should be in the church. It should be Lord Jesus and not the law. It should be worship in your heart instead of Sabbath days or burning incense, and your heart is nowhere near God. If you believe in your heart that God raised him from the dead and worship that and preach that, then the church and the Jews can be only saved by Lord.
The Jews cannot be saved under the law by the rituals of the law, but they must be saved by Lord Jesus, not by the law. Paul was saying, not by the law, not by circumcision, not by the rejection of the prophets, not by their worshiping the golden calves, and not by the distress of Isaiah the prophet, who said, "Oh, who has believed our report?" Isaiah was very discouraged because the Jews are rejected.